There's a massacre, as far as we can tell, even with an internet blackout, being perpetrated against kids who were at university, who were, on TikTok until a few weeks ago, who were dreaming of a better future. I think Donald Trump, who is quite impulsive, and can be moved by these reports of outrage and massacre on the streets, might feel that anything has to come from the skies. Hello and welcome to Trump World. I'm Matt Fry in London.
And I'm Anushka Rastana in Washington, D.C. Over the past week, Trump has been reminding us he wants the whole of the world, or a piece of the whole of the world, hasn't he, Matt? I found it kind of amazing when he posted on Truth Social an image of his Wikipedia page, which someone had edited to say President of Venezuela. And he actually put that out on social media. But obviously, the issue we're talking about today is Iran.
It is indeed.
And look, later we're going to talk to Joe Biden's Iran envoy to try and understand more about those conversations happening in the White House.
So we don't really know what's going on inside Iran, but the little snippets that have appeared, and I have a lot of Iranian friends in London and outside in the US, who are in contact very sporadically with their relatives and friends. The picture inside Iran is utterly horrific. It is a massacre perpetrated by the regime against mainly unarmed civilians, some of whom have been fighting back, some of whom have killed policemen and members of the militia, some of whom have burnt mosques and police cars. Yes. But essentially, this is a regime fighting for its own survival by unleashing hell on its own citizens.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely horrific. The world is looking on in horror. And here in the US, Donald Trump is making quite clear that there may be some sort of intervention. He has written on Truth Social, help is on its way. Although when he was asked what help might be, he told someone to figure it out themselves. We know that his national security team has been meeting. We don't know quite what's going on in his head. We never do. But he did, in an interview with CBS, talk a little bit about his motivations.
This strong action you're talking about, what's the end game?
The end game is to win. I like winning.
How do you define that in Iran?
Well, let's define it in Venezuela. Let's define it with al-Baghdadi. He was wiped out. Let's define it with Soleimani.
So we know he wants to look like he's winning, but Matt, this could be really consequential, right? And what America is about to do is something that a lot of people are presumably discussing inside Iran, and a lot of the Iranian people you've been speaking to, what are they telling you? What do they want to see from America?
Well, one thing that's really struck me, Anushka, is that, for the first time ever, really, you have a plurality of the Iranians that I've been speaking to. And of course, these are almost by their very nature, oppositional figures, who are saying to Donald Trump, bring it on, unleash those missiles. And the first time I heard that actually was many years ago after 9/11. I was in Iran because we were expecting Iran to be hit by the US, and it ended up being Iraq. And our government minder, appointed by the Ministry of Information, whispered into my ear during Friday prayers in Tehran, when the bombers come from the United States to Iraq, could they please unleash their load over Tehran first? I thought that was an extraordinary thing to say, and it was a sort of little glimmer of fearlessness from someone who worked for the government. Now you're getting that on a massive scale across the country, translated into the coinage of sheer rage and outrage by the fact that the regime, which has proven to be not just incompetent and brutal, but also corrupt over time, is saying to a population that is really quite well educated. And Iranians have a high level of education. They pride themselves on that. There were all these images from Tehran on social media just a few weeks ago, where, there were kind of bands playing in the streets, and, women in Tehran have taken off the hijab, not because they've been officially allowed to do so, but just because they've taken things into their own hands. And then along comes this very dramatic devaluation of the currency. And for the first time in years, and this is important to understand, the Bazari class, so it's by Bazar, you're not doing it justice. This is the economic kind of beating heart of Tehran and other big cities. These are the people who, when they sided with the Ayatollahs in 1979, made the revolution happen. This time round, they're so fed up with this incompetent and corrupt regime and essentially have said to the regime, this doesn't work. Now, what does the government do? They fire the head of the central bank. They then give something like $7 a month to each household as a kind of payoff, which will buy you, a bottle of oil if you're lucky. And remember, the inflation is so rampant that if you go into the bazaar, into the market in Tehran, which is huge, and you end up, you buy a loaf of bread, as you go into the bazaar, and then an hour later, as you're shopping, you buy the same loaf of bread again, it's going to be more expensive. And I think those combinations of things, incompetence, brutality, and lack of freedom and hardship, I think have made people's cup boil over. And essentially, when you add to that, gunning them down on the streets has created a pretty fearless population. So even if they don't bring the regime down now, even if Trump doesn't intervene in any meaningful way, no regime can survive purely by coercion. There has to be a degree of consent, and you're only getting that from people who are still paid by the government or, small pockets of loyal support in bits of the countryside.
Although we've seen protests before that haven't brought down the regime, and that's what people are scared about.
This is different, I think. This is bigger. It's on a bigger scale. And I think maybe, and getting back to Donald Trump, he is, look, there are many things that motivate him. And, whether it's oil or power projection or whatever, I think for them, they must be cautious that having had a very smooth operation in Venezuela, where there was really very little loss of life, and although you could argue that, it wasn't regime change, it was regime rebooting of a sort, and they were talking to the vice president for months before this happened, and she may have been instrumental in throwing Maduro under the bus. There is no such process as far as we know in Iran, and there's a real danger that, if they try something similar in Iran and it fails, they'll be accused of botching it, basically. But at the same time, I think Donald Trump, who is quite impulsive, and can be moved by these reports of outrage and massacre on the streets, might feel that anything has to come from the skies.
Yeah, and what is interesting about this Donald Trump second presidency is, for all the talk of American isolationism, all the promise of no forever wars, it has been incredibly interventionist. You and I have talked about this so much on the, Channel 4 news bulletins and on this podcast. But, there have been strikes on Syria, on Nigeria, on Somalia, on Yemen, on Iraq, on Iran last year when there was the war with Israel, when he actually this week described his strike on a nuclear facility there as flawless. And then, of course, we've seen what we've seen in Venezuela. You talk about Venezuela, the people of Venezuela wanted regime change, and many will feel frustrated that what they actually got was, yes, Maduro going out, but the vice president, who was frankly up to her eyeballs in the same administration, carrying on, and America probably having more influence over Venezuela than Iran. So there will be some nervousness about it. Now, we know that Donald Trump has met with his national security team. They then met again on Tuesday this week themselves. The options they are said to be discussing, and I'd just like to ask you about these, Matt, are economic sanctions. We've already heard him talk about tariffs for those doing business with Iran, but economic sanctions on individuals within the regime, cyber attacks that could quite try and disrupt some of the issues that you've been talking about in terms of communications, a kind of symbolic strike, one which is there to show American support, but perhaps not with much follow-up, perhaps hitting particular buildings that are seen as quite symbolic, a strike that actually tries to take out the supreme leader himself, which is being talked about more at the moment, or a kind of bigger intervention. I would say I don't get the impression that they want to do a bigger intervention. Everything we've seen before this has been more like a surgical strike. There is a lot of resistance here, including from J.D. Vance, the vice president, to that. Talk me through some of those options, Matt, and what you think might be likely to come and the impact it would have.
There's something to be said in favor and against all of them. So if you take things like sanctions, there are, of course, already sanctions in place against Iran. They were triggered after Trump pulled out of the nuclear accords, which he did almost immediately when he came back into power. There are sanctions also imposed by, many European nations against Iran. But despite those sanctions, Iran has been doing, economically on one level, not so badly because they're selling a lot of their oil to China. They have, very close links with Russia, as we know. A lot of the military hardware from Iran was bought by the Russians to be used in Ukraine. So they are part of the kind of wider axis of authoritarian governments, which also includes Pyongyang and so on. So economically, they could have survived quite well if it weren't for the absolute cock-up, that led to the hyperinflation and then the collapse of the currency, which was then felt immediately on the markets. Now, part of that was a result of what happened last June in the so-called 12-day war, but part of it is just down to the sheer incompetence of the Ayatollahs. And that is something that has been very much registered by the so-called Bazari class. Now, the second thing is, so sanctions, okay, you can increase them, but that's not going to have an immediate effect, because I guess what they're thinking of is, how do we stop the killing on the streets? How do we use this opportunity of fearlessness and rage to work against, to tip over so that the regime actually falters? So you're looking at cyber warfare. Well, that can certainly, the Americans have used it before. There was a famous Stuxnet virus, I think it was called, where they basically stopped the centrifuges of Iranian enrichment facilities. I think that was that was a Democratic administration that did that, not the last Trump administration. So they can do that, right? They've got the ability to do that, but that doesn't necessarily make a difference, especially when the nuclear program has been sort of kind of put on ice anyway by the war from last year. And also, if the internet is shut down, and that's one of the reasons why they're shutting it down, you then have much less ability to go in there and hack stuff, okay? So cyber warfare doesn't really work if the country's gone offline, okay? Not to the same extent. And then you have military strikes. And I guess what they must be thinking of, can we take out the Ayatollah, which would be an obvious thing to do. They shied away from doing that in June because they thought that would be a step too far, but I'm sure they're thinking about that right now. If we take him out, the guy's in his 80s, he sounds very frail, although still, very ruthless. Does that actually make a difference when you have an entire security structure, the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij militia, the regular army, when they're kind of seem to be unified in opposition to their own population? So maybe that won't make much of a difference. The key thing I would be looking at, and we just don't have access to this, is when they say they're talking to the foreign minister, who else are they talking to? Are they talking to people in the regular army? Generals in the army who don't like, who answer to the president, who's supposed to be a bit of a reformer, who don't like what's going on. The way these regimes fall is when the institutions split and one institution, especially in uniform, sides with the people on the streets. That's what I would be looking out for. And I wonder, to what extent that can be accelerated by military strikes or hindered by them. I'm not sure. It could be accelerated. You could find that, IGRC generals think, I'd rather live than die under an American bombardment. And so maybe they're now talking through back channels to, Marco Rubio or Pete Hegseth. Who knows?
I think there's been an interesting shift in tone from Donald Trump this week. Earlier in the week, he was talking about diplomacy. He was telling reporters, they call me, I've been talking to them. Obviously, I'd prefer diplomacy to take action. And then we had this kind of hardening of his tone where he suddenly said, on Truth Social, I'm not talking to any officials anymore. Get out there, protest, take over your institutions. And I was wondering what had led to that. And one thing that was being reported on Fox News, which we know he watches, was the Ayatollah's Russian language X account in Russia. He had written in Russian that America better be careful not to miscalculate here. And it actually wasn't being that broadly reported on or taken that seriously, but it was being reported on Fox News. And I did wonder if Donald Trump had seen that and had felt some sort of anger to it. And in fact, his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, then came out just outside the White House and suddenly spoke to a load of journalists saying they're saying one thing in public and they're saying another thing behind the scenes. We know that he is quite sensitive to all of that. I think one of the risks here is that every single, strike that we have seen from the US has been a surgical strike. Trump has wanted to say victory, as he did in Venezuela, without actually getting the thing that a lot of the people on the ground want, which is regime change. And so there is no sense that they want to follow up with what might be required in Iran to try and stabilize the country.
I mean, I think the difference in between Venezuela and Iran is very stark. Venezuela was a slow bleed, a population that was deeply upset by levels of corruption and incompetence and all that stuff. But they weren't gunning down their own people on the streets. This is different. I mean, there's a massacre, as far as we can tell, even with an internet blackout, being perpetrated against, kids who were at university, who were, on TikTok until a few weeks ago, who were dreaming of a better future. And again, I come back to this thing. This is a highly educated, sophisticated, and mostly secular population. They feel completely out of sync with the Ayatollahs, with the theocracy that's been running Iran quite badly for all these decades.
And practically, do you think that a strike then leads to a change in regime, or what are the risks in between?
Well, anything could happen, right? You could have a strike that could embolden, the really hardcore of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and one of their kind of, hard generals, the ones that weren't killed in the June war of last year, takes over and becomes even more brutal. Or it could be that, there are conversations that suddenly happen quite quickly between Reza Pahlavi, the man who would have been crown prince, the son of the late Shah, and various oppositional forces inside Iran, of which there are plenty, but as we've said before, they're all kind of quite bitterly divided against each other. But there's nothing like this sort of degree of brutality to bring even adversaries together and make them contemplate things that were, unthinkable, just a few weeks ago. I just want to tell you this one little story. I interviewed the Iranian foreign minister, the last Iranian foreign minister, but I interviewed him literally 10 days before he died in a helicopter crash, which also killed the Iranian president. And the final question, I said to him, what are you more afraid of? Donald Trump getting re-elected or your own people? And at that stage, I noticed that his legs started to shake. It was shaking. I mean, his knee was going up and down like this. And he was looking at me daggers. And he was really upset by the question, answered in Farsi, and said something along the lines of, how dare you suggest that we're afraid of anyone? We have the greatest democracy on the planet, interview, end of interview, right? It was interesting that this man who was the embodiment of unruffled diplomacy suddenly looked quite ruffled. So I do think there's a degree of fear from the regime towards what's going on the streets. And I think, and Trump knows that. And again, what haunts him is, I don't do anything at all. These people get hung and strung up, and forget about the Peace Prize. But I mean, it's just sort of, it will keep him up at night, and it should do. Or I do something and it goes wrong. And then, of course, there's always the specter. We mustn't forget this. Jimmy Carter's presidency was to some extent brought down, or rather he became a one-term president because of the botched rescue operation of the American diplomats who had been kidnapped in Tehran for, over a year. They tried to rescue them. No one was rescued. It was a huge humiliation for Jimmy Carter, and it was one of the reasons why he lost the election.
There is the other thing as well, just looking at this from an American point of view, which is the reason people are quite surprised by all the interventions, is that, Make America Great Again, the MAGA movement, is hardly supportive of the idea of foreign interventions, and certainly not in the Middle East. They, really hate the idea of the forever wars that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan and the impact that had on American soldiers. And also there is an economic issue here at the moment. People are really feeling the squeeze. They want Donald Trump to focus on domestic issues. I find it interesting that all of this comes after, the administration has been talking so forcefully about the so-called Donroe doctrine, the renamed Monroe Doctrine, the idea that they're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere. And now suddenly they are weighing up the idea of military action in Iran. I don't think we need to go into massive detail because neither of us are in Donald Trump's head.
We're always in his head, Anushka. We live in that head, for goodness sake.
We live in his head. I'd be somewhat more skeptical about his motivations than you on this one. But nevertheless, he is weighing it up. I think it could be quite difficult for him here in the US, not only in terms of his base and what they might think about it. Ultimately, they may support him anyway. But I was in the Capitol yesterday, and there is also, fury across Congress about the fact that all these strikes are happening without congressional approval. There is precedent for that. Barack Obama did it. But we've now started to see Republicans vote with Democrats, enough of them, much to Donald Trump's fury, to try to limit his ability when it comes to war.
I think there is, however, a key distinction here, which I think, he will be taking into account. There's a difference between forever wars that involve American boots on the ground. So occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, incredibly costly and ultimately botched. Airstrikes, from 30,000 feet is a different matter. Venezuela, a surgical operation that doesn't involve American troops staying in Venezuela more than 2 hours, is a different matter. The big risk with Iran is that you do something that ends up either making no difference at all, in which case America looks toothless despite baring its teeth, or you do something and it's horribly botched. You hit the wrong target, and we may never know because of the internet blackout. But so there are risks there. But I would think, and I may be wrong here, I would think that those risks outweigh what they think are the benefits of some kind of action. And I would put money on something happening in the next few days or weeks from the American side. And of course, every issue has to be seen in a different light. So there are Republican senators or congressmen who are perfectly happy to see military strikes against Iran, although they are holding their breath, and crossing their fingers. Those same senators, and we heard one last week who said, using force to take Greenland is, and I quote, weapons grade stupid. So that's another issue that you'll be reporting on, where, the people aren't quite so unified. They don't see the logic of it. You don't break up NATO for the sake of Greenland, for goodness sake. There are other ways of securing American interests than that. So, again, everything is case by case. Iran is very much sui generis. It's tricky. It's complicated. There are lots of risk factors there. But there's a sort of overwhelming, I think, desire, driven by the rage that is felt at the images we're hearing about, to do something. And if you've got that toy box, ballistic missiles and other things at your disposal as the most powerful man in the world, you're going to use it.
So we're joined by Rob Malley, who is a senior lecturer at the Jackson School at Yale University, but also served as Biden's Special Envoy to Iran. And you've also been a former Middle East advisor in 3 presidential administrations. So you've been in the room, Rob. What do you expect that Donald Trump and key advisors are discussing in terms of Iran right now?
Well, I think President Trump has made it as clear as it could be. For clarity in his case is not always the most evident attribute, but in this case, I think he's signaled that there will be a military strike. We know he likes dramatic, spectacular strikes. He doesn't like long wars, but he likes short, dramatic confrontations in which the U.S. has the upper hand. So I think we should expect sometime in the coming days some strike on regime targets, security services. But who knows? He could always surprise us. But everything he's telegraphed so far suggests that, on the back of what he considers a spectacular success in Venezuela, having warned the Iranian regime, wanting to be on the side, as he puts it, of the protesters, and believing that at this point Iran doesn't have that many options to respond forcefully against an American attack, my assumption is that we will see something.
And Rob, the success of the Venezuela operation, especially the extraction of Maduro, putting him on trial in New York, was so extraordinary and, of course, much trumpeted, forgive the term, by the Trump administration. It kind of sets the standards, doesn't it? Do you think they've been planning something, similar with the Ayatollah Khamenei in recent months as they were planning with Maduro? Do you think they've got a clear idea of targets in all this? Or are we dealing with a kind of more instinctive reaction from the president, who is as upset as many people are about the reports of violence on the streets of places like Tehran?
Yes, I'm not sure that what's truly motivating him is the level of upset at the levels of violence. I think he has other considerations in mind. Again, I think he is fond of these dramatic, spectacular military raids. When he killed Qasem Soleimani, bombed Fordow in Iran, the nuclear site, and now what he did in Venezuela. So I think he's a bit intoxicated with his own self-perception of success. And he may also have been told by a number of people around him, certainly by the Israeli prime minister, that the Iranian regime is very weak at this point, and it might take just a little push from the U.S. to see dramatic changes in Tehran. I personally doubt that, but he may well be convinced of it. And at this point, he doesn't need a big success coming out of this to be able to claim success. He has defined success in a way that guarantees he won't fail, because for him, success is showing that he has done what no other president has done, that he's intervened militarily on the side of protesters in Iran, and that by striking something, he'll achieve some target. I don't think he could kidnap the supreme leader, but he could kill regime officials, he could target security installations, he could do something that says to him and to his constituency, I said I would act, I acted, I said I would punish the regime, I punished them, and if they continue, I could punish them again. So he sets the bar wherever he wants it to be set, and he will claim success regardless of what happens.
But it is interesting to watch Donald Trump talk about success in Venezuela when at the moment the same regime is in place. Venezuela and Iran are very different, right? In Venezuela, America can exert quite a lot of influence at the moment, it says, because of the leverage of the oil. But just looking at it as an analyst, not thinking about Trump's motivations, if you have these options on the table, economic sanctions, cyber attacks, a limited, targeted strike, or something bigger, looking at the situation now from your point of view, what do you think are the merits of those different options?
I mean, we're not even talking now about the legality of some of these options, so let's put that issue aside. I think the question comes down to what's the objective, and it's not clear what the objective is. Is it just to signal American resolve? And again, the fact that when the U.S. president threatens something, he acts on his threat, and that people pay a price for ignoring his threats. If that's the objective, that's one thing. Is the objective to deter and stop the Iranian authorities from massacring their people? Very hard to see how a military strike achieves that. Is it to topple the regime? Again, it's hard to see how strikes, however extensive they are, would lead to the downfall of the regime, and certainly hard to see how it transitions at that point towards the kind of government that the U.S. says it wants to see in Tehran. So the objectives have not been defined other than living up to the president's threat. Now, I do want one big caveat, which is that the president can, as you said earlier, he acts by instinct. He could change his mind. So maybe everything I'm saying now will turn out not to be true, 24 hours from today. But at this point, everything signals that he is in that mode of wanting something. And again, he will define whether it's successful based on his own criteria. You're asking me.
But what do you think should happen if you were there?
If the objective right now is to stop what Iran is doing to its people, I don't think that a military strike would achieve that. I think there are other ideas that are out there about cyber forms of cyber warfare that would prevent the regime from communicating with itself, so that you disrupt their operations. You could also have efforts to try to help the Iranian people be in a better position to escape the complete blackout that's been imposed by the authorities. But frankly, the sad truth is there are very limited options if the goal, when a government or regime feels itself existentially at stake, to try to stop it from going after people who they believe are threatening their rule. There are very few options that are out there, and that's just the reality. But there are steps that can be taken to try to limit the ability of the government to repress its own people. I wouldn't claim that those are going to be wildly successful.
Rob, I've speaking to a lot of Iranians this week, mostly outside Iran because of the internet problems and the phone lines being cut. But I've really noticed two things. Compared to last year or any previous time, even those people who don't particularly like the Trump administration are so enraged by what the regime has been doing to protesters on the streets that they are almost begging him to intervene. I mean, even if it doesn't result in regime change, or even if it doesn't, it's not the domino that topples all the other dominoes. They just want someone to suffer, and they think that only Trump can impose that degree of suffering on the regime because the street is helpless. The second thing that I've really noticed is that Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Shah, who's been living in exile in Maryland for decades, and I've met him a few times. I interviewed him once for the BBC, and who seemed to be utterly irrelevant for many, many years. The State Department, under, Bush and Obama wouldn't go anywhere near him, right? His name is now being shouted more and more on the streets of Iranian cities, maybe because there's no obvious alternative. And I just wonder whether you had any dealings with him when you were working for President Biden and for his predecessors, and whether you think he is at all a viable option, either as a transitional figure or maybe as part of some kind of future government.
So first, I mean, I think we're both hearing many of the similar things. I really don't want to be in a position here where I claim that I know how the Iranian people feel. I don't know. I've not been there for decades. I was there only 3 days decades ago. I don't know that how the majority of Iranians feel, but it's very understandable that a number of them who either have been victim or their families have been victim or friends have been victim of the crackdown, that they won't help from anywhere, anytime, any place. And if right now, as you say, the one country that seems prepared to do something for good or ill is the United States, and it is President Trump. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is that feeling among many Iranians looking for salvation, and they look to the one place where they think it may come from, whether that's a majority view, a plurality view. Again, I'm not even going to try to speculate, but there must be a level of desperation and despair on the part of many Iranians who are prepared to look at anything and who may think nothing can be worse than what we're experiencing today. On the question of the former Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, there was no formal interaction with him when I was in the Biden administration. I think I had one chance encounter at a conference at one point. I think you're right that his name is being clamored more than any other name at this point, partly because there are no other names. I'm not sure, again, that that's an indication of his level of support among the masses of Iranians, or what it would mean if at any point there's a transition in Iran. Would he be somebody, or would it be people who've lived in Iran, who've struggled in Iran, and who at some level know their country better than he does? I think it's very hard for anyone on the outside to speculate, because we are in uncharted territory. When there's no name but one name, that's the one name people are going to chant. There's no other name right now. He's one person who's visible. He obviously is well funded. And so I think he has that name recognition that others lack. I don't think that necessarily translates into political, organizational support on the ground.
Can I ask you about the risks of military action? What do you fear would happen if Donald Trump goes ahead and strikes Iran? And just, I'm sorry to say, it sounds a little hopeless from what you're saying. You know, whatever the rights or wrongs of military action may be, this regime is doing really terrible things on the ground. Can you see a way out? Can you see a place where we get to where the regime does fall?
Oh, listen, when I say that, whatever pessimism you may have detected in my tone, it's that I don't think that externally inspired coups, revolutions, uprisings have a great track record of success, particularly when it comes to the United States, and we could go down the list. So it's very hard to imagine that as a result of military strikes, you're going to see either the regime deciding they're not going to, fight back against the protesters, or a change in the regime. Now, I do think the dynamics within Iran itself are the ones that are going to be the most important to watch. And it is clear that the regime has lost legitimacy, has lost resources, assets, the ability to sort of reproduce the conditions of its rule. So at some point, I believe there will be a fundamental transformation. I don't know when, and I'm not sure what role the outside players will play. But the dynamics in Iran, I think the intensity of the protests, the fact that we now have protests every few years. So it's not as if you have a protest, then you wait a decade and you have another mass protest. They're happening more frequently with greater intensity and with people feeling they have less to lose. So I do think that there will be a change in Iran. I'm not going to try to put a date on it, a timeline on it. But I think your question has to do with what the impact of an American strike would be. Again, part of it depends on how intensive, broad, and what the targets of the strikes will be. But I think the range of responses, and I'm really sorry to sound as speculative as I will, but I do think there's so many unknowns. It goes from the Iranians simply saying, we're going to absorb the shock. We're still standing on the day after. And so, yes, the American president thought that by striking us, we're going to collapse. We're not collapsing. We're still standing. And that's our victory. Depending on how severe the strikes are and how threatened the regime may be, they may decide to lash out with nothing to lose and go after oil installations, American personnel in the region, Israel. All of those are possible. I wouldn't put them as the most likely responses, because then Iran is really inviting a much more massive retaliation by the U.S. or by Israel. So I think they will calibrate their response depending on the severity of the attack.
I mean, as you said, these regimes are rarely toppled from the streets, even if ordinary protesters have lost their fear, and there seems to be quite a lot of that going on. They're just, this is a last chance saloon, both for them and indeed for the people running the country or misrunning the country. I just wonder, when you were, on the Middle East desk of the previous administrations, did you reach out and did you get any traction at all with, people in the, in the Revolutionary Guard or in the government, in the elected, civilian government, who might be ready to, who might now be, talking to the United States, behind closed doors, because the way these things collapse often is from within.
So before I answer that, I just want to come back to your last point, which I think is important about how internal dynamics can evolve. Let's just look at a comparison, which is a very inexact comparison. But the Syria, you had an uprising, which was, and it's the state that was much weaker than the Iranian state, an uprising that was really funded, armed by the outside, that seemed to be threatening the regime. And yet the regime held on between 2011 to 2024. And so that's one lesson, that regimes could survive. But then at the time when it was least expected, the regime crumbled. And I think there are two lessons there. It could take a long time because regimes that are fighting for their survival have the fire and that have the firepower to do so will do so. But second, that we should never be surprised by being surprised. Things could happen all of a sudden. It could take a long time, and then all of a sudden, the house of cards just collapses. On your second issue, listen, I don't want to talk about what the intelligence community might have done, some of which I will not even be privy to. I would say that the level of the political, the State Department, the White House, no, there was not attempts to try to get members of the regime to defect. It would be too dangerous for them. It would be too dangerous for us, and probably we wouldn't be particularly good at picking and then probably exposing the people that we were reaching out to. So no, that was not part of my experience. Again, what the intelligence community might be doing, I leave that to intelligence officials to talk to you about.
Matt suggested that, Trump's motives might be about trying to help the people who were protesting, and you suggested that might not be the case.
Can I just say, just really quickly, in defense of Donald Trump, which is something that I don't do every day, I have no doubts about the fact that he's looking at oil and strategy and projection of power. But I do think it is not beyond, his wit or our wit that you can be both strategic and tactical while at the same time feeling, very human outrage about, reports of massacres of innocent civilians on the streets. And when he talks about people getting killed in Ukraine, it's kind of similar. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't follow from that he's got a coherent strategy for how to change the regime. But I'm pretty sure that he's pretty angry at the moment at the kind of reports that are making us angry as well.
Of course. And also, I think angry a bit about anti-American rhetoric coming from some of the members of the regime as well, because I noticed that his language shifted suddenly. But on Venezuela, for example, he spoke a lot about human rights before. He never spoke about democracy after. And I just really wanted to ask, in terms of Iran, it's a bit different. The oil industry is much more separate from the US than the Venezuelan oil industry was. Are there energy commercial interests in Iran that Trump may well have his eyes on that America could actually realistically get to one day?
So first, you make a fair point. Donald Trump is a human being. So sometimes one could forget that. And he seems to be become emotional when he sees some pictures of children being killed. I would say that his outrage is selective, and his outrage is often dictated by other considerations, as you just said. And so he may, what's happening in Sudan may, for some reason, bother him less than what's happening in Iran for other reasons. But anyway, I'm not going to try to decipher his motivations too much. Yes, I think in his mind, he sees Iran as a huge market and as a huge producer of oil. And whenever he sees that, he believes there may be financial opportunities. I think the Iranian regime tried to play on that when they said we could reach a deal and then you could have billions of dollars of investment and who knows what. He may be imagining that there's an outcome in which, just as as he's doing with Venezuela, the U.S. will derive some financial benefit from Iranian oil. Again, it's hard to see exactly what he may have in mind. For him, it may be more abstract, amorphous, but if you have a friendlier regime in Tehran, one that depends on the U.S., one that's going to want sanctions relief and is prepared to trade some financial benefit in exchange for getting financial sanctions relief, I'm sure that's in his head, and I think that's one of the reasons why he finds Iran a particularly interesting country to deal with, and he said that many times. He never leaves when Trump speaks, you have to listen carefully because he often speaks the truth even inadvertently, and he often speaks about Iran's economic potential. I think that is one of the motivations as to why he thinks that either at some point a deal with maybe a slightly different regime or with a completely different regime or some kind of bargain can be done in which financial benefits would accrue to the United States.
Rob, really fascinating. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us. So look, obviously talking about foreign policy again, Matt, and Trump world obviously will often do that. There's been a lot of domestic stuff going on here. I've obviously not long come back from Minneapolis where an ICE agent shot and killed Rene Good. I think that story is going to run and run because of the reactions to it. And it is such a tragedy. I'm sure we'll be talking about that soon.
Indeed. And maybe Donald Trump is even thinking that he might distract from, trouble on the streets of America by launching airstrikes, onto the military installations of Iran. And I think with that, Anushka, we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, that's it. Please do press subscribe or follow wherever you are listening or watching. We really appreciate it. And do leave us any messages. That's it for us this week.
Bye.
See you next week.